Welcome to the Book Bungalow's virtual book launch of Sara Flannery Murphy's latest book, Girl One, which hit bookshelves today. I had to stay up late Sunday night to finish it because I just couldn't put it down. Really, it's that good. We were excited also to have the opportunity to celebrate with Sara as she and her fellow author, Mindy, do you say Mejia?
Mejia, yes.
Mejia. Talk about Girl One, its story and characters in particular, and maybe writing in general. My name is Tanya Mills, and I'm the owner and manager of the Book Bungalow in St. George, Utah. As Southern Utah's only independent bookstore offering all new books and a full range of events, we're continuing to do our events virtually through July, but we hope to open up again to in-person author events shortly thereafter. That's not to say that we won't hold virtual events in the future, because one of the few positive developments that came out of this whole COVID thing was that bookstores could suddenly get access to authors from across the country, like Mindy, and even from around the world. So in future, we'll be doing a mix of live and virtual events. In fact, while this launch is virtual, Sara happens to live in our area and will be available this Saturday morning at 11 on our front porch to personalize copies for those of you who live in the area and have either bought the book or decide to during this launch. The rest of you who purchased a bundled book ticket will be receiving signed book plates in the mail. And the lucky among you, of those of you who have ordered Sara's new book before this launch is over, will win a prize. I'm going to show you really quickly. We have 10 to give away. I don't have a signed copy, but we have Margaret Atwood's The Testaments. We do have a signed copy of Adam Silvera's Infinity Son. We have 2 signed copies of Writers of the Future, Volume 36, signed by the editor, David Farland, who also lives here locally. We have an advanced reader copy of a science fiction book, The All-Consuming World by Cassandra Kaw, which comes out in August. And we have an advanced reader copy of Realm Breaker, Victoria Aveyard. Those are, okay, books. We also have, you may recognize these from Independent Bookstore Day, the Blackwing Independent Bookstore Day pencils. We have if any of you happen to have a baby or know someone who's getting a baby, we have a Baby Yoda onesie. And we have finally 2 of the independent bookstores of in the US map from Independent Bookstore Day that we're offering as prizes. So moving on, if you haven't yet ordered her book or bought it as a bundled ticket through Eventbrite, you can order it now. I put the link in the chat. If you want a chance to win a giveaway, you need to have ordered or bought the book by 7:45. I've also posted other links that might be of interest. One to buy Mindy's book, Strike Me Down. We're out of it at the bookstore, so I can't show it to you. As well as links to both authors' websites. And finally, there's one to register for a virtual science fiction panel discussion event that I'll talk about more at the end. All of you, though, will receive a follow-up email with these links again, as well as the YouTube link to the recording of this launch as soon as I post it on our channel. And finally, as a housekeeping note, let me point out that our store policy forbids harassment of any kind. Anyone who posts or asks anything that could be deemed as harassment will be removed from the event, but I doubt this will happen here. Now let me introduce Sara and Mindy, and then we'll turn the time over to them. Born in Little Rock, Arkansas, Sara Flannery Murphy and her family divided their time between the capital city and the Arkansas Ozarks. After studying library science in British Columbia, boy, you got around. Yeah. She received her MFA in creative writing from Washington University in St. Louis and began getting shorter works accepted in such publications as The Guardian and LitHub. Her first novel, The Possessions, published by HarperCollins in 2017, received starred reviews in Publishers Weekly, Book List, and Library Journal, as well as several other honors. And now she's out with her second, Gone Girl. Currently, she lives in southern Utah with her husband and 2 young sons. Her website can be found at saraflannerymurphy.com. Mindy Mejia's internationally acclaimed thrillers, including The Dragon Keeper, Everything You Want Me to Be, Leave No Trace, and now Strike Me Down, have been translated into over 20 languages. Her books have been picked for People's Best New Books and listed in the Wall Street Journal's Best New Mysteries. A CPA and graduate of the Hamline University MFA program, she lives and works in the Twin Cities. You can find out more at her website, mindymejia.com. Mindy, why don't you start the conversation now? And remember, all of you out there, if you have questions or comments, don't put them in the chat, post them in the Q&A. Okay, go ahead, Mindy.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here for your launch party, Sarah. I was so thrilled when I got your invitation because, as I mentioned earlier, as soon as I finished reading Girl One, I immediately needed to talk to someone about it. I was like, I need to have a conversation. I hope that the Book Bungalow is selling this in pairs, you know, so that you all have someone to talk to about it. You have a book buddy.
Thank you. That's like the nicest thing you can say.
It's true. It's true. I was, you know, some books are like, oh, that was great. This one I was like, I need to talk to people. I need to dissect this. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it with you tonight.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for agreeing to do it. It's, you know, so lovely to be able to talk to you. I remember when we first met, like probably like 4 or 5 years ago now, like you mentioned to me that you had written a book about virgin birth, and I was like, oh, like that's what I hadn't even really written it yet, but I was like, I have this idea that involves virgin birth. So I was so excited when you said that, and like now it's really cool that we're able to connect and talk.
Yes, yeah, and that was probably like 3 lifetimes ago. It felt like
it does feel that way. Yeah.
It was the Midwest Independent Booksellers Association, I think, the Heartland Fall Forum, which was this fun event. I mean, it was local for me, but you traveled for it. It was in Minneapolis.
I did. It was like the first book event I ever did, actually. Like the first like really big official one. And I was super, super nervous about it, of course, because I'd like flown far away, which now seems like very foreign because I have not flown in a very long time, but this was back in like 2016, so we were all flying around, and I was super nervous about it. And I think we got paired up together like to pitch our books to booksellers, and you were like so awesome and welcoming that it really helped calm my nerves.
I remember, yes, it was the first time that I'd ever done anything like that, because it was this like author speed dating event, right? Where we were in this big ballroom, and there were booksellers and owners at all the tables, and we got paired up, and we were just hopping from table to table. I think we had like 2 or 3 minutes or something to pitch our books. And then we went to the next table with the next table full of booksellers, and it was fun. But I also remember that like I just felt so bad for you. I'm like, she has to sit and listen to this pitch 18 times. It felt weird, you know.
It was always fun. It was always fun to hear it. And then once I read the book, I was like, yep, this is just as good as the pitch. So I have really good memories of that event.
Yes, because at the end then I remember we traded books, because we had our own books that we were like using as props, and then we traded at the end. So, and that was when I got to read The Possessions, which was fantastic. So I was so excited to get the advanced copy of Girl One so I could see what you've been working on.
Oh, well, thank you.
So you mentioned we are maybe 2 of the only authors that have written stories about parthenogenesis. So let's just take a second here to talk about our origin stories, okay, pun intended, of how we came to that topic, because it's not a topic you see in a lot of fiction. So tell me like how you became acquainted with parthenogenesis, and maybe what it is for people who maybe haven't read Girl One yet and don't know, and then how you decided that this was going to be a book. Like I'm fascinated.
Yeah, well, I feel like I came to it in a really roundabout way. So parthenogenesis is kind of the technical and lesser known term for what we usually call virgin birth, even though virgin birth doesn't, fully grasp what happens. But it's basically when an egg fertilizes on its own without, sperm or male DNA. I first came to this idea like a pretty long time ago. When I was a grad student, I was actually in my MFA program, but we were able to take extra courses that weren't writing workshops. And when I was taking this one seminar called The History of the Body, a whole lot of the course covered reproduction and sexuality. And it was really, really fascinating to me because I have come to reproduction from like a privileged stance, I guess, in that I live during a time where we have a pretty solid knowledge of what happens. And I don't think I had really looked to the past and thought about how mysterious and how weird and inexplicable this whole process would seem to people who didn't have the medical technology that we have now. So I was reading all these wild theories about reproduction, and I kept on being struck again and again by just this kind of sense that a lot of the philosophers or scientists, like very, very early, like BC, who are trying to figure out how reproduction happens, like how we get here, they very often seem to come at this with like a thesis statement, less of like, how does reproduction happen? And more, how are men like the most important part of this whole process? And I ran across this idea that that like men, the father essentially gave the child the soul and the humanity, and like a woman provided, or the person with the uterus, the pregnant person provided like the matter. And if a woman kind of went beyond her station and had thoughts and ideas that were a little too out there, she might be able to reproduce by herself, but this child wouldn't have the humanity provided by the father. So it would be like a monster. And like this was in gosh, like the early 2000s. It must have been like 2007 or 2008. And I was very, very, very into monster stories back then. I was reading a lot of Angela Carter. I loved horror movies. I think I had just found Ginger Snaps, which is like a female werewolf movie, which I thought was so cool because werewolves are usually presented as men. So it was really exciting to see one that had a teenage girl as the werewolf. And so my brain just like instantly took this idea and like filtered it through the lens of my horror movie monster obsession. And I was like, ooh, like that would be such a cool origin story. And then over the years, it kind of developed and developed. And I moved a little bit away from the idea of monsters and actually started looking at maybe the more scientific side of virgin birth and like how we've been really fascinated with it throughout the ages. I feel like in the 1950s, there was like a big search in the UK for somebody who was born a virgin birth. And all these different people came forward, and the scientists were able to kind of eliminate some of them, which was very cool because I actually had a template. There's a section in Girl One where Josie is thinking about like the tests that she and the other miracle babies underwent to see whether or not they really were like solely genetic material of their mothers with nothing else there. And I was actually able to look at real tests that people had done in the past, which was amazing. So that kind of weird idea led me into looking into parthenogenesis more and more. And it gradually developed into Girl One.
Wow. I love that. And one of the tests in the book, it's a skin graft test that
Yes.
Josie and her mother Margaret undergo, where there's like a little postage stamp size piece of skin that's removed from each of them and transplanted to the other. And if there was any, patriarchal DNA, it would reject. So is that an actual test that happened in the UK in the 80s? Was that something that is real that you pulled?
Yeah, it did. And that was actually, there was only one pair left who had passed all the other tests. And when they tried the skin graft, I think one of them rejected it, and I cannot remember which one, but one of them, I think maybe the daughter, she didn't accept it, and that was sort of like their answer. But in girl one, I was able to make it successfully happen, which I really loved too, because it meant that she was walking around like carrying a little piece of her mother with her all the time, which I thought was like kind of a cool way to show that even when Josie isn't the biggest fan of her mom or doesn't feel emotionally close to her mom, like she literally, like in addition to being pretty much a clone of her, like has, a little piece of her mom with her at all times. I mean, like a little morbid, but sweet.
Sweet at the same time. Yes.
Yeah.
So Josie she's our protagonist. She is girl one, the first virgin birth daughter that came out of the homestead in the 70s, and there were 9 total. And so all 9 of these girls are at 8. One of them dies when she's 2 in a fire in the homestead with Dr. Bellinger. So the homestead is destroyed, and there's 8 girls left. It's so fascinating. It's fascinating reading it, because it's these 8 girls that have their own identities, but they are genetic clones of their mothers. And to see the dynamics and the interplay between the daughters and the mothers when they are genetically the same person. And you just mentioned the estrangement between Josie and Margaret. How was that to write? I mean, when you're writing a character that's genetically the same character, but 2 very different people, how did you approach that?
That was a lot of fun to approach. It was also very difficult. I think honestly, a lot of it I did draw on my own experiences, because I feel like my own relationship with my mother, and I think a lot of people's relationships with their mothers, maybe particularly daughters, you have this person in your life who is so much like you, but you can become really obsessed with the places where you diverge instead of the places where you're similar. And maybe there's something important about that, too, about establishing yourself as a different person. And I think for Josie, that was really difficult because she felt so similar to her mother on the outside that they were like doppelgangers, that they could be mistaken for each other. But on the inside, she felt like they were so extraordinarily different, and she wanted to be different from her mom, I think. And then over the course of the book, I did try to address the fact that she comes more to terms with being similar to her mother in these ways that she wasn't able to see initially. So I did have to kind of dig deep into the mother-daughter dynamics, which is always very intense. I think that's one of the more intense relationships that a lot of people can have in their lives. So it took a lot of soul searching and a lot of thinking about the ways that I have viewed my own mom and the stages I've gone through where I want to not be similar to her, and the moments where I'm suddenly really startled by the fact that I'm incredibly similar to her, both catching a glimpse of myself in the mirror and being like, wait, I look so much like her, or making a decision that without me even realizing it so closely mimics what she would do. So that was, even though it's sci-fi, and Josie's relationship with her mom is this weird kind of reproductive landscape changing event, they still kind of grapple with all these things that mothers and daughters, since the beginning of time, not since the beginning of time, but for a very long time have grappled with.
Right. And I think that's what makes the characters in the story stand out for me too, just because you can tell how true those relationships are, those mother-daughter relationships. And as a daughter and a mother, I just was able to identify, with all of them in certain situations, and feel that relationship, the tension of those relationships, and also the love. So that was just one of my many favorite parts. But we meet Josie when she is called home. There's a fire in her mother's home, and her mother's gone. And so the book unfolds in this kind of epic journey, this quest that she goes on to find her mother. So even when there's this kind of friction between them, there's still this incredible love that is driving her. She wants to find her and find out what is happening, where her mother went. Hopefully she's okay. And that journey takes her to all of the other girls who she has not been in contact with since the fire at the homestead. So there's a whole new dynamic here now of this kind of epic road trip, and there are so many locations that you explore in the book. When Tanya read your bio, I mean, you can tell that you've also lived, all over and been in many different places. But how did you choose these settings? Like, because we were in Chicago, Illinois, we're all over the Midwest, Kansas, Minnesota. The homestead itself was in Vermont. We end up in Utah. So, like, how did you choose the settings and where we were going to go in this book, where Josie was headed?
I think I wanted them to be sort of evenly divided over the country a little bit. I didn't want them all to be like in the same spot. So I wanted there to be like this real sense of forward momentum. I definitely wrote this book with Google Maps like open constantly. And the order of the towns they visited would sometimes change because I needed like the timing to work out. So it's like, oh, if they're too close to this town, then they won't have time to have this scene in between X town and Y town. I actually feel a little bit bad for my copy editor because, the big, I can't even remember what it's called, like the style sheet where I was looking at like all the locations that had to be marked and had to be mapped out. And my copy editor put like so much work into that near the end to make sure to catch like any little discrepancies. I knew that I wanted each one to live in a town that would, I don't know, maybe give like slightly different glimpses into what could happen to people like living with this very strange origin story, like that some of them had chosen places where they could more or less sink into anonymity, and others were really, really trying to be still prominent and still get something out of this situation. It was a lot of fun to write the road trip. It turned out to be very fun because then 2020 happened and I stopped going on road trips myself. So I was editing the book during pretty much the first half of 2020, probably. And every time I edited it, it was like a treat to be able to at least go on a road trip in my head, in my imagination. When I was a kid, I really loved the Narnia books. I was like a huge Narnia nerd, and Voyage of the Dawn Treader was my absolute favorite one. And I think it's kind of funny because that's not a book that people would necessarily associate with Girl One, but my absolute love of that book and like the way that they had to travel to all these different places to try to figure out what had happened to these missing people kind of influenced the structure of Girl One. So I'm glad that I was able to kind of sneak my Narnia obsession into a book.
Yeah, I don't know if I would have
way.
As an influence.
I know. Yeah,
I love that. Did you have other books or in like particular that were influences for Girl One?
Geek Love was a really big influence. I read that one when I was in my early 20s, and it's such it's like an incredibly distinct weird book. Like I don't know that I've still in the past like 15 or 20 years read anything quite like it. It's just so odd and like so self-assured in its like weirdness. And so I found Geek Love, and for those of you who haven't read it or aren't familiar with it, like A, it's a wonderful book, and B, it's about these very eccentric parents who want their children to have like superhuman abilities or to be kind of special or strange. So they experiment with all kinds of chemicals, and they have children who, I mean, I think one of them has like telepathy. So yeah, just that idea of parents deciding that they wanted their kids to have superhuman abilities, and just the fact that like their abilities kind of came through the act of birth, I guess, or reproduction. It's not really a superhero story, but it's just like a really interesting story about how parents can like literally shape their children and how they affect them growing up. So that has been like a long time favorite of mine. I really loved The Power by Naomi Alderman, which came out like I think in fall of 2017. And I read it as I was starting to work on this, and the idea of women having these abilities that kind of tilted the scales in a slightly different direction, or a drastically different direction, really, that was really helpful to read as I was working on this, and kind of gave me some more confidence that I could manage to tell this story.
We have a question that came into the Q&A. I wanted to cover that one quickly. Mary asks, I've ordered the book, but haven't gotten to read it yet. So hopefully this isn't a stupid question. There are no stupid questions, Mary. If there's no male DNA, would there ever be a male baby? Do you want to answer that one?
I think that for humans, it would always be like a genetic clone of the mother. Like, I don't think our chromosomes are what necessarily make us men or women. So I think that the chromosomes would always be XX in this case, but that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be, different genders ultimately.
And the Parthenogenesis Story that I wrote actually was about Komodo dragons, and in reptiles, the alleles are opposite than they are in humans. So in reptiles, parthenogenesis will always lead to males as opposed to females, because the females have the opposing alleles and the males have the same. So the copy of the female mother's DNA results in males. So fun fact.
Yeah, I think that's so cool. That kind of threw me off when I was reading the Dragon Keepers at first, because when the eggs were hatching, and I was like, oh, like they're like male Komodo dragons, they're like baby boys. And then I of course read your explanation and was like, oh, right, okay, like it's really interesting that in different species it would work in different ways.
Right. So if anyone else has a question, definitely drop it in the chat. We'll be checking those. But you mentioned in the influences, the books that you had read, touching on the powers of these characters, and not necessarily superhero stories, but just exploring, those extra abilities. And we definitely get to explore that here in Girl One, because as Josie goes on this road trip on the hunt for her mother, with this reporter, kind of as a sidekick almost. He's this very determined reporter that is helping her, but is he too determined? It's very intriguing. As they go and are looking for answers, they are meeting all of these other girls and discovering that these girls have extra abilities, and maybe Josie also has extra abilities. So tell us a little bit more about how the Parthenogenesis story led you to this story of extraordinary women that are maybe even more evolved than having been the product of a virgin birth.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Well, like I said, I first had that idea kind of connected to the idea of monsters at first. And it took a while to kind of move beyond that and realize that the story would be a lot more interesting if maybe they had, maybe if it was more of like a superhero origin story. And one thing that I was really trying to do with the powers, and that my editor was like incredibly helpful with when I was working with her, because she was just an editor who like read it and immediately understood everything I wanted to do with it, but had like ideas that were so helpful in focusing my vision. And so this was one thing that we really worked on, was that each of the powers that the different girls have, they play a little bit into different maybe stereotypes or fears about women that we really encounter. So for example, like Josie is able to control and manipulate, like with her just like with her eyesight, which I was kind of trying to play on the idea that when we look at women in power, we can often treat them as if they're manipulative, or as if they have like this certain level of control that doesn't always like really pan out in what truly happens. So each of them, I think, like Kate as well, who is the most matter of fact about her abilities and is the one who is the most in touch with them, you know, she has the power to like heal, which is really playing into more of a positive idea about women, I think, and that they can be, you know, healing or life-giving. So yeah, so I think the idea of parthenogenesis and the idea of parthenogenesis affecting the woman's DNA kind of like evolved and tied into this idea that maybe all of their abilities pointed to something that women, even if they do not have superpowers, maybe have to face overall.
And I loved that Kate did have those healing abilities, because I mean, this is obviously, it's an inherently feminist book, you know, but Kate as a character is sort of the most outwardly, you know, feminist of all of the girls. And so to give her these healing powers, you know, it just it just spoke to the healing power of feminism. I loved it.
She was really fun to write. She was fun to write because I feel like with Josie, I had to kind of have her learning about this for the first time and contending with it. And that was a lot of fun. But with Kate, there was something very satisfying about her just kind of being like, yep, like this is who I am and this is who I've been for a while. And I'm just completely okay with it. And I think that Josie kind of took her cues from Kate as well. I was just trying to like show like different sides of how people might react in this situation where they find out that they have this ability, and you know how it might affect their personalities and their choices. And I thought it would impact different people like very, very differently. Mm-hmm. So they were like two different sides of the coin.
So now this is the second book that you've written that's you know, solidly in the speculative, under the speculative umbrella. Mm-hmm. And I love speculative because like it can be anything, right? I mean, we can have literary speculative, we can have sci-fi, horror. You know, it's just such a broad umbrella. It can be an aesthetic, it can be, you know, more plot driven. How comfortable are you in this umbrella? Do you think you will continue to write speculative? Is that where your imagination lies?
I think so. Yeah. I'm not always happy about it because sometimes I think it would be a joy. You know, every genre has its own challenges, but sometimes I think it would be such a joy to like write a book that fit a little bit more neatly into a certain genre. Just because I think a genre can give readers solid expectations. And, you know, when you're writing something that's in a slightly weirder genre space, I always have this fear that like people will come to it and be like, what is this? You know, but my brain definitely goes in that direction. I pretty much all of the ideas that I have for novels involve some kind of weird speculative element. And if they don't have it when I first have them, like the more I think about them, the more I'm like, and it could have ghosts in it, you know. Mm-hmm. The one I'm writing right now also involves it's a very speculative premise. So maybe one day I will try to write a book that's not speculative and just see, like, maybe it would be a lot of fun and maybe I will enjoy it and thrive. Even though, again, I know that it's probably like a grass is always greener thing. And I feel like most writers kind of always fantasize about writing in a slightly different genre. And then once you get there, you're like, oh, right, like writing is always going to be tricky. It's always going to have its challenges and pitfalls.
I agree. I feel the same way about like being in the crime fiction genre, you know, and like if I try to do something else, I feel like there's going to be a dead body somewhere anyway. You know, like
Yeah.
someone will probably die if I try to write a rom-com, you know, I don't
Right.
know what in me. So I understand.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of always end up returning to like what your imagination wants you to write somehow. It's very hard. It's surprisingly hard to overcome that. I feel like I always used to look at writers and be like, wow, like that's so amazing that they can so consistently stick to these themes and they have like these motifs they return to again and again. Like, how do writers do that? And then I started writing myself and I was like, yeah, I don't think it's a choice. Like, I think you're just riding along and all of a sudden you like have this certain like motif or this certain theme that you didn't even expect to explore, but you know your subconscious mind is just like flinging it out there. It's really hard to overcome that.
Yeah, 100%. Yes, yes, we write our own trauma again and again.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah,
We have choices about this.
I know.
As a bookseller, I have to say that when you combine genres, it makes it difficult for us to know exactly where to put you on the shelf.
Yeah.
But so I'm going to be putting you on the science fiction shelf because that's where Margaret Atwood is, and it's like alternative history in a way. This book
Yeah.
made me think of alternative history. So
It is, and we haven't even talked about the timeline yet because the homestead in the book, I mean, that began in the 70s, and Josephine's search for, you know, her mother and the other girls, I mean, all the present action is taking place in the 90s. So how did you decide to kind of back us up into that era?
I was always very drawn to the 70s. And I knew that I wanted to write the earliest part, the commune in the 70s. And once I went looking, I found out that there actually were real communities where women would come together and attempt to kind of unlock the secrets of virgin birth. Like they aren't very widely known. I was only able to find like a few academic articles about them, but I mean that was enough to be kind of amazing because it's so cool when you have this idea and then you go looking and you find like real world examples of it. And I feel like the 70s were kind of a tumultuous time, like a time of change, and there was kind of the back to the land movement. It felt like there was a kind of like strange creativity and flexibility in people's mindsets in some ways, that made this seem like, you know what, if people are going to go and try to figure out parthenogenesis in the middle of the Vermont woods, it's probably going to happen in the 70s.
true.
And then the 90s came, well, in a boring way, it ended up just coming about because like if she was born in 71, she would be in her early 20s in the 90s. Writing it in the 90s did end up being a lot of fun though, because they couldn't rely on like cell phones. They couldn't rely on the internet. It gave it a little bit more, not really an old fashioned feel because I'm not really prepared to refer to the 90s as old fashioned, but it gave it made the road trip a little trickier for them, and it made finding these women feel more satisfying than if they could just like punch them into their phones. They had to do a lot more work, and I got to write about like phone booths outside of gas stations and stuff that is increasingly feeling almost nostalgic now. So the 70s and the 90s are two eras that, I mean, the 70s especially, I've always felt really drawn to them. And it also ended up being an interesting choice because Louise Brown, who is the first, hers was like the first successful birth as a result of IVF. She was born in just in 78. So I feel like there were some really big jumps ahead in the 70s in terms of reproduction. And it was very startling and upsetting to people, I think. Like now IVF is so commonplace that we don't like bat an eyelash about it. But back then, I mean, it was incredibly new and I think really threw people off. And and made them feel a little uncertain and maybe even a bit threatened. So that tied into the 70s theme as well. And yeah, and it turned out, this is kind of dorky, but I'm really happy because I said it in 1971 with no idea of when it would be published, of course, because every book is like just a big ball of uncertainties, but it ended up being published in 2021, of course, which is like 50 years after Josie would have been born. So it felt like a nice kind of symmetrical date for the book to come out into the world. I was really happy about that.
It is really funny how it worked out that way.
Yeah,
I love that.
I know. I was so happy.
Mindy, did you want to read the couple of questions in the chat?
Yes, we do have a few that came into the chat. Ethel says, you mentioned doppelgangers earlier, and I wonder if you researched that phenomenon and what you found, and or if not, what was the most surprising thing in your research findings?
You know, I don't think I ended up researching doppelgangers too much because I was kind of focused in so much on parthenogenesis. And I realized that like if these women were born via parthenogenesis, they would have like no other DNA from another family line, from another person. So they would just be like so close to their own mothers. I do really like doppelgangers as the horror trope. I actually find them like very, very frightening. I don't know why that's such a frightening idea to me, but like the idea of like walking around and like suddenly seeing a perfect copy of yourself is like instant goosebumps for me. I know that they've been used as like a death omen too. It like kind of traditionally, that like if you see your own doppelganger, it's not a good sign and bad things might be on the horizon for you. So I don't think I was thinking of that fully when I wrote the book, but I guess that's kind of symbolically interesting, for Josie and her mother to look so much alike. But in this case, it's hopefully a much more positive omen.
Right. And then Chelsea asks, did you have a hard time staying within the time frame? Clothes, electronics, etc. So like with the historical aspect of it.
I did, yeah. I had to check certain phrases really often. Clothes were like fairly simple because I think that 90s fashion, has never fully gone away and is having a huge heyday now. So I'm like, yeah, I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on 90s fashion. Electronics, that was sometimes frustrating because it would have been so nice to be able to have them pull out a cell phone. But, I kind of knew what I had to rely on. They rely mostly on, essentially on like newspaper clippings and phone booths. And I know that technology was more advanced by 94, which is where the second timeline takes place. But I don't know how easy it would have been for them on a road trip to like take advantage of a personal computer or anything. Mm-hmm. One thing that I really struggled with was language, because I wanted to write the dialogue and just write it kind of naturally. And I had to get into this mindset where I was like, even though you're not writing something set in like the 1700s or the 1800s where their speech might be much, much different, you are writing from a gap of like 20 or 30 years, and there are going to be a lot of differences. I think at some point, Kate says fanboy, like she's teasing Tom and she calls him a fanboy. And I had to be like, was fanboy even be on in people's minds back in 94? And it turns out it would have been, it turns out that phrase was around in the 90s. And also for some reason, think piece. Like I was convinced that think piece felt very modern and or just very contemporary. And I had to look it up and be like, okay, yes, I guess I'm coming at this with maybe too contemporary a lens. But that's my terror, that I'm going to pick up Girl One and read it and find out that I made one of the characters say LOL or something, but I did try to double check every phrase or term that felt a little bit post 94. And it kind of surprised me to see the ones that were like actually in pretty common usage back then.
think
So
there's
you
a
keep watching
question in
the
there.
90s movies.
There's a question by Kate Broad.
Yes, Kate says, this is wonderful, Sarah. Thank you. Yes, Sarah. How much do you know in advance where the story is going before you start writing? And how much do you discover new twists and turns as you go? Have there been any differences in your writing process between book 1 and book 2, and now book 3 that you're writing it?
Wow, those are great questions. I generally do not know where I'm going. I am trying very hard with this third book to have an outline, and it's kind of working. But what it also means is that I have to rewrite my outline a lot rather than like rewriting the entire book, which does save time. But I find I'm in awe of people who are able to write an outline and have it just work on the page and are able to like see it in their minds that clearly. Because for me, like when I write it, I realize like, oh, I wanted X to happen in this scene, but the characters are having a conversation that feels like it's the wrong emotional tone, and it's really hard to get them to bring this up. Or there are moments that I will just realize as I'm writing, and it can be tricky, but I also enjoy having that element of surprise. I think sometimes it can be really exciting to come across a plot twist as you're writing because it can feel a little bit more organic. So I'm trying to just have a hybrid. Like I know that I just have to accept and embrace the fact that I'm never going to be able to write out like a perfect outline and follow it without variation. Like that's just never going to be me. But I basically make an outline, I write, I realize that I need to change the outline. I go back and change the outline, I write, then I change the outline again. It's just a kind of narrowing down. They're just really big, for me, there are just really big things about a book that I can't realize until I'm seeing the characters interact and until I'm feeling what the tone is. And again, I'm like wildly jealous of writers who are able to use outlines, just as I'm like wildly jealous of writers who are quick writers. But I also just have to kind of accept that this is how I work and go with it.
And that's been consistent through all of your books, right? That you write the outline, change the outline, keep going.
It's mostly been consistent. I think I have gotten a little better at using outlines because for the possessions, I don't think I had much of an outline at all. And for this one, I did use an outline much more because it's a pretty tricky narrative in some ways. And I mean, even just like I said, the road trip and like figuring out like, okay, if they have to drive from this state to that state, and I want this moment to happen between these two characters between it, like how many hours is that? How many miles is that? It was really, it had like a lot more logistics to it than the possessions. So I think in this one, I would just I think in Girl One, I would just write and then outline sort of halfway through. But my outline would literally, I think somewhere in my office, I wish I had it within reach, but I do not. I have like literally like a napkin where I was like outlining the final scene. Because it's very, very slapdash and just like grabbing whatever I have and like just kind of writing these cues that I don't think would make sense to anybody else about what I want to have happen. And with this third one, I am like on a tighter deadline, which makes a big difference. And I also think that, yeah, exactly. I'm comforted that other writers do that because I'm always like, what is wrong with me? Like I can't learn to use like Scrivener.
It's whatever is closest to you when you have to write. Yeah.
That makes me feel better.
Do you both use outlines? Mindy, do you use an outline?
I'm a pantser. So yeah, I write the first draft just by the seat of my pants, see where it goes. The characters can get very stubborn for me as well. So I might want them to do something that they have no intention of doing. So it's kind of a fun delusion, when one part of my brain is objecting to what another part of my brain wants to do. So yeah, I don't outline at all in the first draft. I try to outline as I'm getting like the second or third draft, when I need things to become a lot tighter.
Do your editors encourage you to do this with outline? Because it seems to me, Sarah, that you didn't do it with Possessions. I just wondered if it was your editor that encouraged you to try to outline more.
Well, with Girl One, I actually wrote the entire, I wrote the entire book before an editor ever saw it. And my agent is really lovely at giving feedback, but she's pretty flexible and open in terms of like what I want to do as I'm writing it. So she hasn't really suggested specific things like that to me. I think she's mostly just like, I'll read what you have and I'll give you wonderful feedback on the plot and characters and all that. But, however you get there, I'm like, she's fine with it. She just kind of trusts my process, which is maybe not wise of her, but she does. With this one, I actually am writing it kind of already under contract, which is a new experience for me because the other two, I had to write the entire things before, I even knew whether or not they would be picked up by an editor. So with this one, I am just trying to be more on top of it, but no one really asked me to do that. I'm just like trying very, very hard for myself, and we will see how it ends up in the end.
Well, and I don't think there's any one right process. I mean, I think James Patterson is a big outliner. Stephen King is a pantser. They both get it done. I mean, it's however the book needs to get written.
That's true. Yeah. I can get so caught up in that, like worrying that I'm not outlining it right or worrying that I need to do more work in the beginning. And then there's always this point where I'm like, you know what though, I could be like, instead of worrying over this, I could be writing because I know I'm going to get there eventually. So I usually just kind of dive in and like cross my fingers.
Was there any particular scene that was the most fun for you to write?
Ooh, yeah. I really loved the scene in the middle of the book. I feel like I already gave away some spoilers.
Without spoiling anything.
Yeah. So it's kind of in the middle of the book. And Josie and her friends that she has collected along the way have come to a town looking for yet another pair of the another mother-daughter pair, and they do not find them, but they find evidence that something really, really terrible may have happened to them.
Yeah.
And that is like the first big, it leads to like what's the first big like action heavy scene and like basically a fight scene. And I had never ever written one of those before. It was like very outside of my comfort zone. But writing it was incredibly fun. Like I just felt like there was so much energy to it. And like it's kind of a very ominous scene, and like they have to figure out who to trust. And just every part of that scene, I did go back and revise it like 1,000 times because I always do, but it felt very true to itself from the beginning. There are other scenes that like will literally never see the light of day, because they just weren't working. And there are others that have been so heavily changed you wouldn't recognize them. But that one has always been recognizable as what it is, because it was just so fun to write, and it just came to me very naturally and worked in the story very naturally. So yeah, I think that one.
Yeah.
And then, so we talked about it a little bit earlier, maybe before we started the session, but you said that this right now is a standalone, but do you think you'd be coming back to this world, the world of the homestead and the girls?
I would love to come back to it one day. I think I sometimes need to take like a little bit of a break. I always find it easier to kind of clear my head and move on to a different story and then come back with really fresh eyes. But I love the story I told in Girl One, and I think it was the important story to tell, but it was very, very focused on like a specific small group. And I think it would be exciting to look ahead into the future a little bit and see how this had impacted larger groups of people, and where Josie and Kate went next. So I think if I was going to write, I would ideally love to hop ahead by like I don't know, 20 or 30 years, like maybe take us to contemporary times and see what has changed since 1994. So maybe one day, yeah, it would be really fun.
Well,
I'm so morbid too that I'm like, well, this one of the girls' mothers, she died of ovarian cancer. Is she also going to like? I want to see how like
Yeah,
how those their
right.
match up. You know, that's just that's where I go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think about that a lot too, because a lot of us have that anyway, just like wondering about our family history. And we aren't like exact replicas of our parents, but we can look at our family history and our relatives and sort of try to use them to predict how our futures will look too. So I think that would be really intense for the girls. As I mean, they're in their early 20s in the book, so maybe they're like a little bit more in that age where they feel somewhat invincible. But yeah, as they age a bit more, I think that they would start contending with these questions. I mean, now that I'm in my 30s, I think about these questions a lot more than I did in my 20s. So I would love to be able to explore how they feel as they age, and they have this strange genetic history to grapple with.
Right.
well, I think we're about ready to wrap up, unless you had another question, Mindy.
I mean, I do, but I think we can move on to the giveaway.
Go ahead and ask your other question.
Well, I just wanted to ask if you can tell us a little bit more, a bit of a teaser for what you are working on now. If you can tell us anything about it, or if it's too early, like just we don't have to know.
Oh no, I would love to talk about it. This book that I'm writing now is much more autobiographical, I think, than The Possessions and Girl One. And by autobiographical, I mean it's still like, a dozen layers removed from my real life, because that's kind of how I operate. But it does take place in the Arkansas Ozarks, where I was a teenager and where I've spent a lot of time, and kind of contends with like growing up in Arkansas basically, and then like being a grown-up who has come from Arkansas and been other places. So it's a friends group, like a group of outsiders growing up in the Ozarks, who discover these houses that have really bizarre powers that kind of pass on to whoever enters the house temporarily while they're inside it. And as teenagers, they have a lot of fun with this, and then of course tragedy strikes, move ahead 15 years, and now they're all coming back together after something has happened to one of them that has like a really eerie, suspicious echo of what happened 15 years ago that made them all go into hiding from this. I'm obsessed with houses too, so it's like a really fun way to dive into my obsession with like cheap old houses Instagram accounts, and now I can pretend to myself that that's actually research instead of just me lying and looking at Instagram accounts of old broken down houses all night. Sorry?
It's 100% research.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm telling myself. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay, I think we're about ready to wrap up now. I want to thank you so much, Sara and Mindy, for spending this time with us and sharing in the celebration of Sara's book launch. Remember, those of you who are local, and I'm not sure how many of you are, I know she will be available to sign copies on our front porch this coming Saturday morning at 11. Those of you who bought the book and ordered it, it hit the shelves today, so I couldn't mail it out until I'll be mailing those copies tomorrow. And if you're a fan of Octavia Butler and other Black science fiction and speculative writers, you might want to consider registering for the virtual panel discussion we're going to be hosting to celebrate Octavia Butler's birthday, June 22nd at 1 p.m. They'll be discussing Afrofuturism in 21st century Black science fiction. And it will feature several current Black science fiction adult and YA authors. Anyway, finally, let me quickly announce the names of the winners. Now we only have 10 prizes. Well, we have 10 prizes. I shouldn't say only. We have 10 prizes, but only 5 of you purchased the book as a bundled ticket. So I think it's only fair to give those 5 their first choice in the order in which they bought their bundled book. And then I've drawn the names of 5 others who, from the rest of you, to receive the remaining prizes. So to make this easier, I don't have time to list them right now. So I will remind you, and I want to know right now if anyone wants well, let me just say, the first person, Karen Lowe, was the first person to buy the book, so she gets first choice. Karen, if you could put in the chat what you would like, if you want an ARC, either ARC, advanced reader copy is what I mean, if you want that, or the signed Infinity Son, or Margaret Atwood's Testaments, or the Yoda onesie, or the pencils, or the map of the bookstores, independent bookstores all across the US. I need to see your response. Are you even here still? Gosh. Is she here?
Yep, she says Margaret Atwood.
Margaret Atwood, okay, you got it. I will mail that off to you.
Well, the map would make an excellent road trip guideline.
It's true. I have 2 of those. But okay, the next person in line is Chelsea Oakes. What would you like, Chelsea? Map. Okay, you get a map. Okay, Kate Broad is 3rd. You need the onesie. Okay, you get the onesie. Okay, Mimi Douglas, she is a friend of mine from 20 years ago. She's next. What would you like, Mimi? Is she not? Mimi, what are you going to take? Write it in the chat. Raising your hand? You don't need to raise your hand. Just, okay, I'm allowing you to talk. Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Sorry, I was having to run an errand for my in-laws.
Oh,
So
you won
so
one of the prizes. So
yeah. So what's left?
What's left is Adam Silvera's signed copy of Infinity Son, or a signed copy of Writers of the Future, Volume 36, is an anthology of great science fiction and futuristic writing, and an arc, a science fiction arc of The All-Consuming World, or a fantasy arc of Realm Breaker. And another map is still left, and the pencils.
Something that's good to read. What do you suggest?
Oh, do you like fantasy?
Yeah.
Okay, Realm Breaker. I suggest that. Okay. All right, and the 5th person was Virginia Darling. Virginia, would you like to write what you'd like, or where are you? Virginia, is she not on? Huh? Nope, she's not on. Okay. All right, I'm just gonna send her a map. Okay, the other 5 winners, and I don't know how many of them are on here. We got Amy Lambert Godet. I don't know, are you on here? I don't see, so I'm gonna and Valerie's not on here. Daniel Spicer was on here. Is he still? No, but he won. Okay, Felicia, are you on? Felicia Becerra, I see you. Is there something? Felicia?
Mhm.
Yes. Pencils, you got it. Okay. And finally, Orit Bendori. I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right, but I'm not sure if you're on either. No, I don't see. Okay, I will just send to those people what left. Anyway, let's, the people that I've mentioned, if you didn't provide, I will be emailing you for your mailing address so I can send these things out. I'll mail your prizes in the next week unless you're local and you can stop by the store to pick up your prize. And I'll be providing links to both to the recording and to order Sarah's and Mindy's books in a follow-up email that will also include more details on the panel discussion. Again, it was a pleasure. Goodbye to all of you. Stay safe and stay well, and happy writing.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank
Happy
you.
book launch, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It was awesome.